Close your eyes. Now imagine you're standing in a large group of white people. White people who are angry about a recent influx in immigrants from a particular racialized group. And there are speakers talking with more and more inflammatory rhetoric. The words drugs are used, and crime, and degeneracy, and protecting white women. And it becomes more and more explosive until you hear the sound of breaking glass as a teenager threw a brick through a shop window. And then the mob becomes a riot. What country was this? What racial minority was it? What timeline was it? The honest answer is it fits a lot of those. In this particular case, I'm talking about 1907 in Vancouver, Canada, and the anti-Asian riots of 1907. Yeah, we had anti-Asian riots of 1907. The conference riot, whatever you want to call it, had been organized by the Asiatic Exclusion League, which was obvious by the name, a group that were opposed to Asian immigration. The Canadian government had put forward a request to bring 10,000 Asian immigrants in for expansions to the rail line, and the locals were not having it. There was already a lot of anger towards Asians, and the pot boiled over. So William Lyon Mackenzie King, you may know the name. He was the 10th Prime Minister of Canada, so he ran this whole darned country. But at the time, he was just the Minister of Labour. He was sent to Vancouver after the riot to try and make sense of what had happened, what could we have done differently, and also to help with the estimation of damages and things like that. So he spoke with a lot of people, and interestingly enough, didn't feel that the honkies were to blame. It was opium was the problem, obviously. So I was reading about this today, just out of sort of backstory and refreshing my memory in preparation for this. And I was on the Wikipedia page. I know, gasp. But there's a quote from Mackenzie King, and he says he was worried that, quote, opium smoking was making headway not only among white men and boys, but also among women and girls. Very progressive take there, Mackenzie King. Never once did he concern himself with opium issues within the Asian community. It was the threat to white families and white women specifically, which is a very uncomfortable echoing of 14 certain words that I won't be repeating here. The result of the post-riot investigation was the passing of 1908's Opium Act, which is the first Canadian legislation to specifically address drugs. I think it's an important thing for us to remember that drug laws erupted out of racism, because drug laws have always been racist and classist, and drug laws will always be racist and classist. The war on drugs is a nice rebrand for what is really a war on poverty and color. To put that more eloquently, I can perhaps call it a war to protect the status quo. Hi, I'm Big Ugly Jim. And for what it's worth, I'm going to talk about drug legalization and criminalization today. For the record, I don't smoke weed. I used to smoke weed. I have nothing against smoking weed. I just took a long break, and weed in that time, the potency went way up. So I'm terrible at smoking weed now. So I don't smoke it because I suck at it. I have nothing against smoking weed. I do certainly not live a straight edge life, but weed is not my drug of choice. I am supportive of marijuana legalization and drug legalization. I'm supportive of the people that choose to do drugs. There's a variety of reasons to do drugs, and some of them are very necessary. Some of them are totally unnecessary and potentially dangerous. But I support the ability for people to make those choices. And I support certainly the ability to make those choices available to the people who need them. It's also worth noting that as a Canadian, marijuana is legal here. The model that we use is the dispensary model. So a business can pop up that sells marijuana, does so perfectly legally. It is regulated. Staff are trained through government programs similar to how you would train a bartender. You can drive up to a business, walk in, purchase weed legally, and leave with it. This is a fine time to remind you that if you like this video, feel free to like it with a little thumbs up and subscribe and ring bells and I don't know, buy me a pony. I don't know. I probably don't need a pony actually. I don't know where I'd put a pony around. So, with that understanding, let's get right to it. So, weed is legal here. It has not always been legal here, but it has also not always not been legal here. It's a funny scenario. Weed criminalization occurred in 1923 when it was added to the confidential restricted list as part of the Narcotics Drug Amendment Bill. There's a legal history of cannabis in Canada page on Wikipedia that's actually really fascinating and quite an interesting read. And it references a 1922 book, which I have not read because it sounds like utter tripe. It is called The Black Candle by Emily Murphy. Emily Murphy talks at length about the risk that drugs pose to white women, which I believe is pronounced white women, and how drugs are going to corrupt all of us honkies. This is a quote from that book. It is hardly credible that the average Chinese peddler has any definite idea in his mind of bringing about the downfall of the white race, his swaying motive being probably that of greed. But in the hands of his superiors, he may become a powerful instrument to that end. Scary stuff. Interesting because it has that combination of racism and puppetry that I enjoy so much. So, yes, the derelict Chinese peddler is going to destroy the world, but maybe he's too dumb to know. Maybe it's his evil Chinese overlord puppet masters pulling the strings. And this was before the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. Apparently, we've been anti-Asian racists a long-ass time. Who knew? Weed did not become legal until only very recently. And I know growing up here, I was confused by the illegality of weed and the legality of alcohol. Because, as the joke says, if you get drunk, you're, a violent person who will get in bar fights or beat their spouse or, whatever. Crash your car into another car, the horrible things that can happen. But if you're stoned, really, you just, order an extra pizza. Obviously, that's a very simplistic statement, but it's not all the way wrong. The difference and again, we're talking about like average ranges of behaviors. Most people, when they are drinking, would be more likely to have some kind of problematic behavior than those who are smoking weed. The euphoria is very different, and I think the long-term numbers will prove out that weed is far less destructive societally than alcohol. And I think the real reasoning behind what was legal and what was illegal is, first off, in 1923, they referred to marijuana as a new drug. It was part of the reason to open that conversation around what was on that confidential restricted list. So we didn't know about marijuana. We probably knew about it, but we didn't really understand anything about it, and it was a strange and new monster. Whereas alcohol, oh yes, we know all about the alcohol. Fish talks, I sometimes have a snifter of brandy myself. The prohibition on cannabis was something that didn't affect people that were the wealthy elites, whereas alcohol would have. So we didn't want to make alcohol illegal, but weed, who knows? It's a drug. Throw it on the list. But that always struck me as a funny thing because As someone who has done both and knows the difference, there is a strong difference. And the demonization of marijuana, which again, strong racist undertones, all the way through the years leading up to today, marijuana was always a black people's drug. Jazz men would smoke reefer. It was a gateway drug, all of these kinds of things. Whereas alcohol, well, that's just fun in a can, kids. Come on down, right? I grew up with the anti-drug movement. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? That shit was like, that was what I was told drugs were. But alcohol could still advertise in magazines. Cigarettes and alcohol, 100% okay. Not that reefer madness. And yeah, reefer madness. Check that shit out. They're very clearly two similar but different things. And the decision to outlaw one and legalize the other wasn't based around one moment in time decision of which one of these two do we get rid of? One of these two things has to be illegal. Which should it be? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. It was literally, we were never going to make alcohol illegal, just controlled. And at that point, they were in the fervor of looking at drugs to prohibit, and weed would tick all of those boxes. They certainly didn't know whether or not it was a gateway drug. They wouldn't have known if it was addictive or could lead to homicidal rages or anything. They were simply reacting based on it's a drug. Drugs are bad. Put it in the bucket. Now, psychedelics, I can understand a little bit more. Now, I mentioned earlier that I don't smoke weed, but I don't live a straight edge life. Very irregularly, but occasionally, I have dabbled with certain psychedelic drugs. I don't lose any sleep over it. It's not something I have the opportunity to do regularly, nor is it something I would do regularly because psychedelics tend to be a pretty serious time commitment that I just can't make. Nor am I terribly interested in that perpetually being stoned kind of vibe. It's just not my thing. They are a bunch of fun, but there's a lot more to them. Alberta, where I live, has been considering seriously legalizing mushrooms and certain other psychedelic drugs for the therapeutic purposes. There is a very real amount of data that suggests that a large number of psychedelic drugs can be really important in a variety of psychological treatments. Most notably, from my understanding, is post-traumatic stress, where essentially people can use psychedelics to, for all intents and purposes, reconnect with their emotions after some traumatic incident or incidences. And there's, in fact, there actually, I'll include a link in the description below. There is at least one legal medicinal psychedelic therapy clinic that is being opened. So I think that's a very cool thing. At this point, I'll also include a link. My buddy Charles made a movie that is absolutely fantastic, and it is called Alone in the Dark. And it is about trauma, but about trauma management and about understanding trauma and about certain drugs, and in this case, particularly ayahuasca, as a means of healing that trauma. It's a really interesting documentary, and I would say it is critically underappreciated. So please do take a couple of hours when you're free one night. Click the link in the description, and Alone in the Dark it's phenomenal. These are what I would consider the light drugs. Obviously, psychedelics have some, darker drug sides, but LSD versus mushrooms, they're very different levels of commitment. I think because of the clear delineation between things like their addictiveness, their usefulness in medical study, things like that, I still put them in the lighter side of drugs side of things. So I do support the legalization and decriminalization of these lighter side of drugs type drugs. Marijuana is a great example. It has plenty of medicinal benefits. It is not the panacea that some people claim it to be, but it is certainly useful. Most of my family are, in fact, using some form of legal marijuana for medical purposes. Weird that the kid with the mohawk is the one that isn't. But it's also, I think, the recreational side of it. I don't think that should be a problem. We get really fussy about recreational drug use. Who fucking cares? Like, genuinely, who cares? If I am using a drug, let's say marijuana, let's say I go out, push pause on my recording right now, and I go out and I toke on some devil's lettuce. Who did I hurt? Worst case scenario, me. Okay. I hurt myself in a lot of other ways on a daily basis, and it's perfectly legal. I probably didn't try to jump off my building. I probably didn't run into traffic. I probably didn't take over a school with a gun. I probably just smoked weed, giggled a little bit at some stupid thought in my head, maybe drooled on my chest a bit, came inside and had a nap. Psychedelics, same thing. I believe that their prohibition has prevented us from doing a lot of research, and only now are we looking into the medicinal benefits, particularly in mental health, of psychedelic drugs. The exception being the really unfortunate tests that were happening in Ottawa, I guess in the 60s, I think, with the psychopaths and LSD, and that didn't go well. And then, yeah, the recreational side. I don't personally have a problem with people recreationally taking LSD or mushrooms or what have you, as long as they're doing so in a controlled fashion, doing so following rules around things like the operation of motor vehicles or what have you. Right? To me, impaired is impaired. The harder drugs are where a lot of people have a lot more concern. We are in an opioid crisis right now. Everyone knows someone who has died as a result of some kind of opiate related problem. Overdoses, fentanyl, bad drugs in general. It's happening. I haven't recently lost anyone, but friends of friends, I had 2 friends of friends in over the weekend die. So my heart goes out to them. When we talk about hard drugs, we're talking about crack, cocaine, meth, heroin, similar types of drugs. They're not new. They have been around for a very long time. They have been on again, off again legal. Cocaine used to be in Coca-Cola. Bayer used to sell heroin. Methamphetamines have been used for a variety of legitimate medical issues. Crack has never been legal, but crack is really just inhaled cocaine. They're almost chemically identical. So those rich folks who are like, well, I'd do cocaine, but I would never touch the crack. Screw you. You're doing the same drug. The deaths often come either from the lifestyle that's associated with the criminality of drugs or from the quality of the drugs. And we can address the quality right away by legalizing, right? You're not buying laced marijuana at a dispensary. And if you had to, for example, go to your doctor and get a prescription written up for you to get heroin, he's probably going to make sure the pharmacy's giving you heroin and not heroin and fentanyl to make it go farther. We created the opiate crisis. We created it by overprescribing. And you know what? That ain't even new. I found this incredible article on the Smithsonian page. I'll also include a link below for that article because it was a really good read. But it was talking about medical journals in the 1870s and 1880s that were warning about the risk of morphine addiction. We've known that this was an addictive chemical all along. We've been using it knowing that it was an addictive chemical, but hoping that we can control it and help people off of it. But then we don't. We don't. And we make the people who become addicted often, not always, but often become addicted as a result of the medical industry, who then shuts the door on them and says, you can't get any more, but they're addicted, so they get more. These are not necessarily people who were career criminals. These are people who had surgery, and that maybe that surgery didn't go right, or maybe their body doesn't deal with pain well, or whatever. Maybe there's long lasting ramifications of the surgery, but we didn't help them. As to the people who, started off on simple drugs and make their way, the gateway drug. Yes, sorry, I should probably quickly address that and just say every study that we've done recently shows that marijuana and other drugs are not gateway drugs. The people who would be open to a career as a heroin addict, which is a very small segment of the people who are actually heroin addicts, those people usually started with marijuana because it was the more readily accessible drug. But had heroin been available to them, they would have started with heroin. So, gateway drug, the whole concept is stupid. When we look at the people who wanted to get into drugs specifically because they enjoy getting high and got addicted, which is, not a small number of people, absolutely. They still shouldn't die. We should still care about them. We should still do what we can to help them, to make sure that the opportunities exist for them to hopefully get away from those drugs. Methadone clinics get closed down all the time because people don't want that in their neighborhood. But you know what? It's in your neighborhood. In fact, in one of the articles I was reading about, they talked about how the white drugs versus the non-white drugs, back in the early days of drug awareness, they associated with certain drugs with white people and certain drugs with not white people. And that's why the opium thing was such a big deal because, well, isn't it weird how the yellow drug is getting into the white people? If I was to choose how you were going to buy heroin, 10 times out of 10, I would rather it was in a medical office over a trap house. I remember probably a couple decades ago, they were finding heroin in BC that was like 80% pure. And people were massively overdosing because they didn't realize how pure the heroin they were getting was. That should speak volumes. You go to a doctor and you say, "Doctor, I want a prescription for heroin." At least there's a few minutes where that doctor can say, do you have needles? Are you clean? Do you have, do you have any interest in getting off? Because I can help. A drug dealer doesn't have that. I'm not demonizing drug dealers here. On an individual level, I'm sure that a drug dealer, if they cared about you as a person, would be like, yeah, like, dude, let's help you out. But their bottom line is dealing drugs. They're not motivated financially to help you. Comparing that to a doctor who is motivated to care about your overall health and want you to have a healthy life. We can pretend that this isn't happening. It's really easy to do so when we live in very homogenous white areas and no one talks about their addictions. But white people, rich people, they're using drugs too. We live in a society where there is a difference between rich white people's behaviors and everyone else's behaviors. Think about theft. We talk a lot about, theft and stealing and how wrong it is and how people who, shouldn't steal and that all that kind of crap. The biggest theft that happens is wage theft. and no one goes to jail for wage theft. It is a way huger economic impact than shoplifting or stealing in general. The things that we think of as stealing. It's the same thing with drugs. Rich white people smoke crack, do heroin, do meth, the same as everyone else. They just don't get caught. And if they get caught, they have the clout necessary to avoid any problems in their lives as a result. I get that it's uncomfortable for people to be open to the idea of allowing someone a prescription for crack. The image that we got sold about crack was scary, freaked out black people. They were mostly homeless, and they were mostly people who were dealing with a variety of issues. We didn't talk about that. My mind got blown when I heard about Felix Dennis, and I watched his TED Talk. Felix Dennis was a magazine mogul living in, I believe, the UK. Wealthy, I don't know if he's Scottish or Irish, he all looked the same to me, who ran a successful, very successful company. And he ran it while being a crackhead. And in his TED Talk, he talks about that. And he talks about coming off of crack and the decision that he made to do so. It doesn't make you a mumbling zombie crazy person. The reality is, we use drugs to treat pain. Mental pain can be pretty brutal. Crack's not going to do you any favors. I'm not saying it will. I don't believe in the necessary medicinal use of crack. But I sure do believe that the story that I was told about crack cocaine was a lie, and a racist and classist lie. The origins of drug prohibition were based on race, based on white people could do laudanum, and that was okay. But yellow people doing opium, what a travesty. And what if it degenerates into white society? That's what this all is. It's a protection of white society, protecting white women. So we have to stop it. Our jails are full to overflowing. Not all those people are in for drugs, but I bet if you did look at some sociological information, I bet you'd have a huge chunk of those people are not necessarily in for drugs, but are drugs played a role in their incarceration. We need to help people. We need to make treatment services available. We need to strip away the demonization. Keeping them illegal keeps this fake status quo war alive, where white people who are rich can do whatever the fuck they want, and the rest of us, we're criminals for doing the exact same thing. It bothers me that our jails are full of people whose lives were changed by drugs. I don't think jail benefits them. The stigma attached to prisoners when they come out of jail doesn't benefit them. You know what benefits people? Helping them. So yeah, when it comes to the topic of drug legalization, I'm all in. I'm all in for making sure that people get help, making sure that people get treatment, but making sure that people get quality. Why not? The longer they're illegal, the more problems created, the more problems fester. And we're not solving the problem.